start going through it. If Blackboard isn't up yet, or if it's going really slow, just have some paper to write your answers down on, and then you can put them in later. So the first question, which of the following phrases best describes Ebionism? Ebionism was A, a predominantly Jewish sect that denied that Jesus was anything more than a mere man. B, a second-century sect that emphasized the continuity of prophecy as a mark of Orthodox Christianity. C, a first and second century sect that claimed that Jesus is divine and only appeared to be human. D, the earliest expression of Orthodox Trinitarian theology using Jewish terminology. Or E, an early heretical sect that thought of Jesus as the first and greatest of God's creations. Question 2. Which of the following phrases best describes Docetism? Docetism taught that Jesus was fully human and only appeared to be divine, that God sent his only begotten Son to save the world, that God adopted Jesus at his baptism, that God the Father was ontologically distinct from the Son, or that Jesus was fully divine and only appeared to be human. On to question 3. Which of the following lists includes all of the figures identified as dynamic monarchians discussed in class? A, Theodotus, Artemon, and Paul of Samosata. B, Noetus, Praxius, and Artemon. C, Artemon, Paul of Samosata, and Arius. D, Papias, Theodotus, and Ignatius. E, Mo, Larry, and Curly. It could be E, guys. Question 4. What is the principal tenet that was taught by Sabellius? A, God is 3, but he expresses himself in a single mode. B, God is 2, existing eternally as the Father and the Son. C, God is 1, but he expresses himself in 3 different modes. D, God is a divisible being made up of composite parts. Or E, God reveals himself principally through the Greek theater. Could be E. And question 5. Which church father records the teachings of Praxius in his polemical monograph against Praxius? A, Hippolytus, B, Tertullian, C, Irenaeus, D, Origen, or E, Athanasius? And that concludes the second quiz from last week.
Thank you. So, if you weren't able to get your answers in on Blackboard, Palmer, will you leave the quiz open for another 15 minutes or something like that? So, make sure that you get the answers in the next couple moments, but you can submit them for another 15 minutes or so. Great. Tim, this is an odd request, but do you have control of the windows? Is it possible to open those windows? That'd be super. I was just thinking, why in the world don't we have the windows open? It's so lovely outside, and I think we all fare better with sunlight. So thanks if you can manage to find out how to do that. Okay, scholars, let me offer you something that I actually hope is really practical. And actually, I'm going to postpone our conversation about monasticism for just another moment. It's just one thing or two things, perhaps, that I want to say concerning Trinitarian theology before we move on. So thanks for your indulgence. I want to offer this to you as, or I want to ask you, how would you explain the Trinity to a friend or somebody that you actually meet in a personal conversation? How would you actually explain the Trinity? Here is, let me give something to you quickly that probably you may have seen. This is quite popular, but it's called the Shield of the Trinity, and it's a map, if you will, of the set of relationships that are described by the Council of Nicaea, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. We have God the Father and God the Son. You know what? I'm actually going to take off the word God there. I'm just going to write. We have Father. We have Son. So here's a pictorial graph, if you will, of the relationships that are described by the Council. We have Father. We have Son. We have Holy Spirit. These, since the apostolic days, we've known to be the names for God. And all three are God. We describe them all as divine. They all have deity, so we could describe them all as God. But I'll put an equals mark with a slash between it, between all three of these individual relationships. So, excuse me, the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is not the Father, and yet all three are and can truly be predicated to be God. That's a nice, handy little map called the Shield of the Trinity that sets up the relationships between the persons of the Trinity and the Godhead. How would you explain this to somebody if you were asked to describe the Trinity or explain the Trinity? Let's say you're having coffee with a Muslim friend who has a very different view of monotheism. How would you begin to explain this? And I'd like you to answer that question if you would. How would you try to explain the Trinity? Go ahead, please. Okay. Okay, and when you say you'd use the Athanasian Creed, whoever will be saved and following and so on, what about the Athanasian Creed? Okay, so you'd use the language of the Athanasian Creed to try to explain that. Okay. And what about the mystery of 3 being 1 and 1 being 3? What do you do there? Thanks so much for the light, Tim. Marcus? Okay. Okay, actually I didn't hear that well enough to understand, Marcus. So what was Jonathan Edwards' description of the Trinity? Ah, okay. Okay, good. No, that idea actually goes back quite a bit. Augustine will wrestle with the usefulness of that idea, and the truthfulness of that idea, that the Trinitarian relationship is a love relationship. You have the lover, you have the beloved, and you have the love that binds them, right? So Augustine will play with that idea. He actually qualifies it pretty heavily, even though for some reason, we still continue to identify as that being an Augustinian idea. But right, no, it's a traditional idea. Jonathan Edwards didn't come up with it, but he works with it a bit, doesn't he? Good. How can you explain this? Go ahead, please.
There was some I heard before that, in a sense, both Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all different in the sense that they different things, like different descriptions and reasons. For different roles of the Son, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. Yet all three of them have all that encompasses. So all of these attributes of God, one of them holds. So someone would explain it. This could be completely out of left field, but the idea of the fact that let's say you have people, right? So each person is different in what they do. You can't really extend it as far as being out of those, but in a sense, they are still all three of them are still functioning as.
Okay. Yep. And the idea that you're sharing there sounds a little bit similar to what some of the Cappadocian fathers would come up with, this idea of the difference between the persons being a relational distinction. So one woman can be mother, daughter, and sister, and is the expression of these three different persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are they is some of the distinction being made their relationship to one another. So they are God, but in the inner council of God himself, there exists this set of relationships. Is it a relational distinction? Is that what you're getting at? No. Right. Right.
But they all share the same characteristics. They're all omnipresent. They're all omniscient. They're all.
Okay.
They all share everything that makes God God.
Right.
They all share. They all have.
Okay. You know, I think it's true in as much as you state that. The converse of that becomes dangerous. But as positively stated, yes, that's a true opinion. God does act differently in these persons. Now, the converse of that positive statement that we don't want to say, the only difference between these different persons is the role that they play. That's the only difference between them. There is no substantial, there is no difference in person. That, of course, you're not trying to say. And again, to use the language that we established last week, yes, there is a difference in the persons as they express themselves in the economic Trinity, that is, in the way that we experience them in the revealed order, in the created order and through God's revelation. But we believe one step further, there's also an ontological distinction between the persons. So yes, in as far as you said that. Good. How would you explain this, Marcus? We'll take one more suggestion and I'll give you what I've got and we'll move on. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's precisely the Latin language that you used to explain that. There's three persons, there's one substance. Then in the Greek tradition, there are three hypostases, and there's one ousia. There's one substance, there's three persons. Fine. Okay. Let me offer this to you. You can do with it as you wish, but I hope this is useful. And it means something to me, so I share it. If I'm asked to share the Trinity at a coffee shop on a napkin, I might draw something like this to establish that we're not talking about a marriage relationship. We're not talking about 3 parts to an egg, just to clear the air, just to get some of the most basic problems out of the way. This, I think, is helpful to set up the types of relationships that we're talking about. Beyond that, The illustrations that mean the most to me and engage my imagination would be that of time and space. Let me share them quickly with you. It seems to me that space is a Trinitarian experience. And those of you who have had AP classes in physics might tell me differently, but it seems clear to me that the way we experience reality is in a three-dimensional context. I know some of you like to think of fourth dimension as being time and so on, but our human experience is clearly three-dimensional. That's the way we experience the world. What is the relationship between the dimensions, three dimensions? Is the first dimension the second dimension? No, they're actually fundamentally different. Is the second dimension the third dimension? No, they're fundamentally different. But are they all space, and are they all representative of space? And communally, do they actually articulate our experience of space as a unified reality? Actually, yes. Can you explain the Trinity by an analogy to space? What do you think? Or time, and I'll just put this on the table. We can discuss it as much as we care, and we'll move on. Time actually seems to have of realities. The same set of relationships is present in our experience of time. Now, again, I'm talking about the way we experience it, not mathematical possibilities of time. But our experience of time is very much the same way. We have the past and the present and the future. Are they the same? Well, it depends on how you mean it. The present is not the past, and the past is not the present. Those are fundamentally different realities. Are all time? Yes, we could affirm that. And would our experience of space be possible without one of those dimensions? No. You would experience space as an entirely different reality. Our experience of space is necessarily a three-dimensional experience. Is our experience of time also necessarily tripartite? Yes. Without the past always flowing out from our experience, and without the future always pouring into the present to make the present what it is, to experience one aspect of time, a past or the future, something like that, would be an entirely different human experience. Can you explain the Trinity by an analogy to space and time? I think you can, but here's your chance to shoot it down. Does anybody want to comment on that? Go ahead, please. Okay. 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 And yet, I won't fight you on this, but let me give one small further plea to see time as also Trinitarian in its structure. Our experience of time, we think of this as the present moment. The present cannot exist without your experience of the present. It has to have a context. It has to have 5 minutes ago. It has to have something that's coming 30 seconds from now. Your experience of the present actually cannot be stripped of past and future. The present, out of the context of future and present, to me is an absurd idea. But I'll let the ideas are these useful ideas, so if they catch your imagination, that's all I'm looking for. What do you think? Thank you for that feedback. Time, space, useful analogies of the Trinity? The present can't exist without your anticipation of the future. You can't finish a sentence without anticipating that you'll have an opportunity to do so. You can't think a thought without anticipating that you're moving into a new reality, always entering new time, that you have time to finish a thought or an idea or a motion or a gesture or a comment. So that's all I mean. But if it's problematic, it's problematic. I won't go to the wall for this. Any other ideas? Okay, last comments and we'll move. Go ahead, please. What, I'm sorry? Yes. But I don't know what partialism is. Okay. Okay. Well, that's what's interesting about, maybe I'll stick to the space analogy if it's safer, but I think that's what's very interesting about space, is that you can't speak of one dimension as a third of space. It's not a third of space. It's a unique requirement of space. But you need all three of these to make space the way we experience it. It's not as though it's... this is certainly avoiding the modalist problem, isn't it? Where God, as a monad, extends himself in these three forms. That's not the way space operates. It's not that space is a unified reality that extends itself as a first or a second dimension, but there is no fundamental distinction between these dimensions. It seems to me that this set of relationships is preserved. Tony? Okay. Okay. Right. I think the question of a husband, wife, and child, could that be Trinitarian? In an alternate universe, it probably could be. The problem is, in this universe, if you're trying to explain to a Muslim the Trinity, this is going to take us very much in the wrong direction. So many misperceive the Trinity as being a marriage relationship. So just on a practical level, I would strongly encourage people to steer away from any marriage-type relationship analogy, because it's too likely to take people in the wrong direction. So God the Father married Mary the Virgin, and they produced the child Jesus. Too much of the world is too ready to hear that as what the Trinity is. So, good. Marcus, you'll get the last word, I think. That's a good question. It's not explicit in the Confessions, is it? He doesn't pull that in explicitly, but I would assume that he is doing that for Trinitarian reasons, I would guess. Okay. You've all been very patient with me. I just wanted to take an extra moment on that because I do want the doctrine of the Trinity to be something that you can explain. Let me share a terrible theological joke with you. My doctor father used to say that there are 5 ways to God, speaking of Aquinas' 5 ways. There are 4 ecumenical councils, there are 3 persons, there are 2 natures of Christ, there's 1 substance, and there's no proof. So, in other words, all of this classic Trinitarian teaching about God can be a lot of theory with no actual practicality to it. And I would just implore, no, this is an extraordinarily practical doctrine and something that you will have to be versed in and be able to explain. So please engage it. Thanks for your patience. Dee Dee, I guess you get the last comment. Okay. Good. Okay. Well, it depends on the context. So if I'm speaking with a Muslim person, actually I might sidestep the whole conversation and just talk about Jesus, because that's really the important point with them. Is Jesus a prophet? Is Jesus more than a prophet? Is he God? That's our that would probably be the first thing that I would, direction that I actually try to steer the conversation if I'm talking with a Muslim, because I think that would be a more genuine way to actually articulate our differences. Just straight go to the person of Jesus. That's probably where we actually are fundamentally disagreeing. Now, yes, if you're speaking with a Mormon, for example, they're going to want to talk about Scripture, and they'll probably do it pretty well. So yes, you're going to have to get into Scripture for that conversation, for sure. Yep. Good. Okay. Thanks again for your patience. Let me talk to you about the history of monasticism. We won't finish it today, but we'll get a good start today. After the Nicene Council, after all of this this huge theological wind had blown through the church, and the 4th century was an extraordinary period of transformation for the early church. Constantine comes, Christianity is licit. Before the end of the century, Christianity in a Catholic form, and what I mean by that is a Trinitarian form, a non-Arian form, Christianity is the only tolerated religion in the Roman Empire. The 4th century, the 2 bookends of the 4th century are dramatically different time periods. And I like to think of it this way. If you think of who a Christian bishop was at the beginning of the 3rd century, who was that guy? Well, I see in my mind this scrawny, underfed, old guy who would have been a bishop because, and why is he a bishop? He's a bishop because he knows how to suffer, because he's been faithful for over a long period of time. He's a bishop, and I see him with a small congregation gathered around him. The early 3rd century was a time of terrible persecution, as were spots in the 2nd and 3rd centuries as well. So early 4th century, I should have said. Early 4th century was a time of terrible, unprecedented persecution. And the Christian church was a barely tolerated, it was not a tolerated minority, it was a persecuted minority. And bishops were given spiritual authority because of their personal example and their history of suffering. At the end of the 4th century, the church looked quite different. Who are the bishops at the end of the 4th century? Well, they're dressed nicely. They're people of social significance. They are pastors over large congregations. Christianity has become many times more popular through that century. They hang out with political types once in a while. Once in a great while, bishops might even be required to go and meet up with the emperor in a council. But aside from even these great ecumenical councils, there were other smaller councils that were taking place where politics and church mixed freely. Those who came into power as bishops were well educated. They were the social elite. What a difference in what has happened in the church in the space of only a century. What a difference is taking place. And one of the movements that grows out of this huge time of transformation in the church is the monastic movement. After Constantine, the empire is not hunting down Christians and persecuting them. So what are those who want to really express their love for the faith with a total life commitment? What are they going to do? How can they express this in a society that's becoming lax, in a society that's becoming well-fed, overweight, generally? What do they do? Using that as a parable. The whole Christian church is becoming pampered, I should say. What do those who had a drive to stand for the old-fashioned faith, what do? Well, they become monks. One of the unexpected result of this, quote, conversion of Rome and this changing of the ecclesiastical landscape will be that the monastic movement takes on a whole new force and a whole new power. Now, we think monasticism to us is a very foreign concept. It's a very strange thing. You might even think of it as basically unchristian. Likely it's a very foreign thing to you. Let me try to be a little bit of an apologist for monasticism as actually one of the greatest institutions of the Christian church. No joke. Monasticism is one of the longest lived institutions of the church. So for those of you for whom that means something, that's a powerful statement in and of itself. Monasticism has been around in a strong and clearly traceable form for the better part of 1,700 years. What other institution in Christianity, except the church itself, has been around and thrived that long? Well, the book, the New Testament canon. I mean, there's going to be a very small list of things that have been that long thriving in the Christian church. The Apostles' Creed, yeah, you're looking at a very small list of things that have been around that long in Christianity and consistently upheld and followed. When did monasticism begin? Well, the early monks thought it began with Jesus and the apostles. They thought they were living out a prophetic lifestyle. Again, since Martin Luther left the monastery, we tend to look very suspiciously on monasticism. The early monks thought they were following the life of Jesus and the apostles. What is it that Jesus did when he wanted to get close to God? Or before his baptism, for example, when he was being being tried by the Holy Spirit, through the guidance of the Holy Spirit when he was being tested by the devil in the desert. What did he do? He went out to the desert and fasted. That is the monastic lifestyle. You get away from people. You go out on your own. These early monks in the Egyptian desert were often going out into the desert space in conscious emulation of Jesus and the apostles, Elijah, the prophets. They all did this to become close to God, to become intimate with God. Eusebius is writing his church history, and he seems to think that this first century sect, Jewish sect, called the Therapeutae, this first century Jewish sect described by Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria describes them as practicing communal monastic lifestyle, or a monastic-like lifestyle, I should say. They lived out in the desert. They were a self-sustaining community. They desired to get away from society. Eusebius thought these were early monks. We would think of them as not so today. But John the Baptist, Elijah, the apostles, these were the heroes of these early monks. And then the monastic imagination, I suppose, was supercharged by this vision of martyrdom. The martyrs had been heralded as the great heroes of the Christian faith for now several centuries. And with the Roman Empire converted, no new martyrs were being generated. Where does that passion go? That passion for absolute commitment, to give one's life for the faith, that is sort of transformed and appears again in form in the monastic life. These are the new martyrs. Excuse me. If I can, I'm terribly sorry I have a cold. If I can use a little bit of an analogy that may or may not carry much weight with you, but I think it's interesting and worth a quick comment. The missionaries of the last 2 and 3 centuries carried a little bit of that same spirit of self-sacrifice. Many of the missionaries, in fact, were martyrs. But that spirit of giving one's life in totality, laying up everything on the line for Christ, the way that we celebrate rightly that rich heritage of missions and missionaries of those who have gone before, that I think caught something of the spirit for those who are watching this early monastic movement grow. To become a monk had the same spiritual appeal as to become a pioneer missionary. Okay, monasticism at its heart, though, is an attempt to become close to God. And I shouldn't prejudge you, but if you experienced an upbringing anything like mine, you may be tempted to think of monasticism, to fault monasticism, for really being removed from the world, not really effective evangelists, sort of discarding ministry that could be taking place in community. The monks would have seen that very, very differently. They are pursuing intimacy with God. This is a very positive thing that they're doing here. Let me introduce you to anchoritic monasticism, first of all. And the man that I'm going to introduce you to is called Antony of Alexandria. So Antony's story is going to be coupled with the rise of monasticism in the 4th century, and it's also going to be centered in Alexandria, where, again, the Arian crisis was so prominent. And the type of monasticism that he represents, we could call anchoritic monasticism. Anchoritic monasticism, or another word that we could use would be hermetic monasticism. And what both of these words are trying to get at is that this is a monk living on his own. This is not communal monasticism, where you're going to set up a monastery and live in a community, but this is going to be rather where we have one monk going out to the desert, again, in emulation of the prophetic tradition, in order to get close to God. We don't really know who the first monks were, but Antony of Alexandria has the distinct honor of being an enormously influential figure in early monasticism. So his life story inspired thousands of people to join him in this monastic lifestyle. And if I can use this as an example, too, of his incredible story, his book, which Athanasius, by the way, wrote, Athanasius of Alexandria, the hero of orthodoxy in the Nicene Council, he wrote the life of St. Antony, the life of Antony of Alexandria, and this became a bestseller in the early church. I had a friend when I was in my doctoral program, and she was writing a dissertation on St. Antony's life here, and she was doing a critical edition of the text, and there were over 400 manuscripts today extant from this text. Now, many times in patristic literature of this age, we have just a couple exemplars, or in some cases we don't have any anymore, as that copy of of one of Justin Martyr's texts that I think I told you about, the last existing copy burned in a manuscript fire at the University of Strasbourg Library in 1879. So sometimes we have very seldom exemplars of these books. We have 400 manuscripts of this text. If that speaks to to how popular it was a bestseller. Go ahead, please. What's the relationship between mysticism and monasticism? Is that the question? I think it's a fundamentally different movement. Well, I think we'd have to actually come to terms to understand what we mean by mysticism to actually do that justice. Mostly, the usual way to speak of mysticism will be to speak of this supra-rational Christianity or extra-rational Christianity. It's not based on logic, but it's based on transcendent experience. And if that's what we mean by mysticism, that will appear in its most clearly discernible form in the Middle Ages, probably in response to scholasticism. So theology is going to kind of go two different ways in the late Middle Ages. We're going to have this incredibly rigorous logic chopping style of theology that we will call scholasticism, and perhaps as a response to that we'll also have this very mystical approach to theology. We're just going to experience God. In our unknowing we will experience God. If that's what we mean by mysticism, then this is really a different movement. The themes of spiritual warfare, however, crop up quite a bit here. So the idea of an intense awareness of the non-physical reality, that will definitely be part of the monastic tradition. What's Antony's story? Well, we have it pretty well documented thanks to Athanasius and his life of St. Antony. Antony was born, actually, before I tell you his story, let me quickly just show you a couple other pictures, and then I'll get back to talking to you in just a moment about St. Antony. I had the privilege last year in Israel to visit one of the oldest monasteries, continuously operating monasteries in the world. I think this was from the 5th or 6th century, St. Saba Monastery. You can do a quick Google search if you want. But I was able to actually take some of these pictures. Here we are out in the desert, and I show you these pictures now because I want to get in your imagination the harshness of the environment where these monasteries were. And this is going to be very much the same case, although these pictures were taken in Israel. The environment and conditions are going to be very similar to that which we're going to see in Egypt in just a moment. Here you have the monastery. Clearly over the last 1,500 years it's done all right for itself, and it's been able to build an impressive building. Here is a shot that I took alongside the cliffs right outside of this monastery. And these are the images that I want to get in your mind. Earliest monasticism in Egypt is going to grow up as in caves and in these sort of desert dwellings. So maybe this is the image that I'll leave with you as I get... Well, let me show you a few other caves, though. You see in the rock walls all of these natural caves. Monks loved those because they provided natural shelter. You could make a little dwelling in them. It was entirely natural, and no one else wanted to live there, so you weren't having to always pay taxes and deal with civilization. My fearless leader for the trip, John McMath, doing what he does best. All right, I'm just going to leave the slide here as I tell you the story of St. Antony. It was a wonderful experience for me to see John McMath in his natural habitat. The man's amazing. Yeah. So St. Anthony, he's born around the middle of the 3rd century, so 251. He's born to wealthy parents in Lower, that is in northern Egypt. But when he's about 20 years old, his parents die. And this left him responsible for his one and only sister. One day he's in church. He was raised in a Christian environment, so he and his sister were people of faith. But as they're now orphans, he's attending church one day, and he hears the words of Jesus. If you would be perfect, go and sell all that you have and give to the poor. By the way, this verse of monks worldwide, if you would be perfect, sell all that you have, give to the poor, come and follow me. That's what the monks actually are doing. That's the biblical basis for what they do. We come into our wonderful churches with our after buying our latte, can sit down on a comfy padded pew, and you know the rigmarole. This verse to our context is quite strange. Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor. We can't, if we're honest, we can't make sense of that teaching of Jesus in our environment. So we don't. We excuse ourselves. We talk about how Jesus is being allegorical, even though we hate allegory, or it's some sort of divine joke, the punchline of which eludes us. We just don't make sense of this teaching. But I want you to see that, in fact, it's the monks who are so strange to us that actually can make sense of this teaching. They actually do that. And this is exactly what Anthony does. He actually does sell all that he has, gives it to the poor, and goes and follows God. Now, what does it mean to follow God? Well, he's going to go out to the desert, because that's what Jesus and Elijah and others did. Anthony is not a heartless person, though. He makes sure that the property that he has sold, he takes some of the wealth from that property and gives it to a group of celibate women. Says, take care of my child sister. I'm going out to the desert to meet God. Well, he goes out to the desert and lives a very harsh lifestyle. At first, he lives in a tomb. He makes sort of a man-made cave. This tomb he makes as his home. Anthony is a well-connected person. Many people back from the city know him, so people go out and visit him. Hey, Anthony, what is he doing out in the desert? Did you hear that he went out to the desert? Yeah, he's out by X and X place. Okay, so people would come and visit him. They'd bring him sandwiches and things for him to eat and so on. And he continues to live out in the desert under this very, very harsh ascetic lifestyle. You know the word ascetic, I think, don't you? It means denying physical desires so that we can meditate better, so that we can concentrate better on spiritual things. So be that abstinence from sex or food or drink or something like that. That's the ascetic lifestyle. Again, this is pretty strange to us, but try to get into it just for a moment. Anthony continues to live in this tomb and eventually bricks up the inside of the tomb so that actually he's living inside this tomb and the door's closed. He has this little window where people can drop in food or something if they want to come up and say hi. And one day, one of Anthony's friends come and visits him. They see him passed out in this tomb. So this is terrible. His friend breaks down this door, and they open up the door and pull him back out. And he's this scrawny little guy. He hasn't been taking care of himself at all. They take him back to civilization, nurse him back to health. When he comes to and is willing to talk and so on, and is got a little bit more meat on his bones, he tells the story of how he was having this terrible spiritual warfare with these demons, and that he was knocked unconscious. All right, after he's nursed back to health, Anthony heads back to the desert. After all, he has nothing else to do. He has no parents. His sister is being taken care of by this group of celibate women, and he doesn't have any property. He goes out to the desert to meet God. This time he goes further into the desert. And he comes across an abandoned Roman fort and lives in a Roman fort in the mountainside. Eventually, he's going to find that he lives there for 20 years. It's amazing if you read this book, and I'm sure I have it on the list of great books for you to read if you're interested, but it's amazing in this book just how real spiritual reality is to Anthony. So he'll be describing stories like he's walking around at this Roman fort at night, and the moon's out, and you've got nice clear lighting, and there'll be apparitions, maybe a wolf or a snake or something like this. But Antony learns over time that these aren't actually physical realities. These are demonic realities. And so he'll respond to them spiritually. He'll pray, etc. Or maybe the devil will appear to him as a beautiful woman. But he knows, no, there's no beautiful woman out here in this desert. This must be an apparition. Antony has a surprising amount of interactions with the spiritual reality. David Calhoun, who has a wonderful audio lecture on iTunes, tells me that in Egypt, this monastic ideal starts becoming so popular that the children would play monks and demons. So one child would be the monk, and then all the other children would badger him as the demons. Antony is recorded to have said, "Who sits in solitude and is quiet has escaped from 3 wars, hearing, speaking, and seeing. Yet against one thing he shall continually battle, that is his own heart." It's a powerful statement. And here's where I think we have a lot to learn from the monastic tradition, and where I think we're actually, I'll just be frank with you, spiritually the poorer, because we tend to have disdain for the monastic tradition. Here's where I think we're the poorer. We tend to think, oh, I could escape temptation if only I would pull away from civilization. But I'm invested in community because this is the way that I've got to transfer the gospel and so on. I'm obligated to be here in community. But boy, it would be so much easier if I could just get away from the world. Well, have you ever tried it? The monks tell us from their cumulative experience, when you actually get out on your own, you start to realize that these temptations, these evil thoughts, these evil tendencies actually are coming from inside you. They're actually part of who you are. And that we tend to project and blame everybody else for this, escape this or that temptation if I just pull away. Really? Try it. That's what the monks tell us. And I think there's tremendous wisdom in that. Because, and I'll get off the soapbox in a moment, but to overcome temptation, don't you have to know how it's working and what its effect is on you? And I think we're the less skilled at meeting temptation because we assume it's coming from an outside source. And so our defense mechanisms are actually, in that sense, quite fragile. Whereas if you understand actually, if you learn to become spiritually discerning and understand what temptation's actual operation is on you, you at least know what you're up against. And I think we develop far better responses to temptation if we actually had just a little dose of monasticism in our lives and experience. Good. Okay, but back to the main story here. Eventually, these demons that the monks are encountering become named. The 8 demons of the monastic tradition become eventually the 7 cardinal sins of the medieval Catholic Church. The 8 demons that the monks are always fighting are these: gluttony, lust, avarice, grief, anger, sloth, vainglory, and arrogance. And eventually this list becomes slightly refined and becomes the 7 deadly sins of medieval Catholic tradition. Antony would try to move away further and further into the desert, but the problem was always the same. He was a rock star. Now this is a little hard for us to imagine too, because our rock stars have very different lifestyles from monks. But as one of my teachers said, you have to understand that Antony became sort of as popular as Elvis for very different reasons, but he became an enormously popular individual. And it is hard for us to get our minds around that. Part of the reason why he became so popular is because this ascetic ideal actually floated around generally through Platonic culture, through Greek culture. Platonism had set people up to understand that the physical world was to be suppressed and that spiritual reality was ultimate reality. So to get away from society, from physical reality, and to get into oneself and to meditate, that was something that generally the culture thought was cool and right. And Antony was living out this ascetic ideal like nobody's business. He became a rock star. He lived out this public ideal of asceticism. And he's got all of these young followers who are going out to the desert, finding caves next to his cave, and like trying to soak up this spiritual power. Basically, there's this revival movement exploding. This is the way that I think of it, and I think it's a helpful way to think of it. There's a revival movement that's busting out in the Egyptian desert, and people are flocking there, like to Woodstock, but they're flocking there to learn how to live supposedly on their own, except there's thousands of them now, live on their own and to get close to God. They're going to achieve that ideal. They're actually going to meet God. This is an amazing thing for these people. Wherever Antony went, crowds of sincere and not so sincere people attended him. Athanasius writes in this book, "So then their solitary cells in the hills were like tents filled with divine choirs, singing psalms, studying, fasting, praying, rejoicing in the hope of the life to come, and laboring in order to give alms and preserving love and harmony among themselves. And truly it was like seeing a land set apart, a land of piety and justice." These are Athanasius' reflections about what's taking place in this desert. "For there was neither wrongdoing nor sufferer of wrong, nor was there reproof of the tax collector, but a multitude of ascetics, all with one purpose, virtue." Antony and his life and his story as recorded by Athanasius of Alexandria is the best single snapshot of what's taking place in this development of the monastic tradition. But we also have collections of sayings that come from these so-called desert fathers. We don't have a lot of other carefully written stories like Athanasius' story about Antony, but we do have a lot of wisdom that begins trickling out of the desert and that gets collected in various places. Let me share just a few of these things, and again, I got most of my information here as assembled from David Calhoun's wonderful lecture on the Desert Fathers. Here's some of the stories that begin trickling out of the desert. One day there's a hunter who goes into the desert and who wants to meet Antony and learn from his spiritual wisdom. He comes across Antony and also a group of the brothers. It's late at night. It's taking them all day, this hunter all day, for him to find them. And the brothers are sitting around the fire telling jokes. Antony doesn't understand. The hunter doesn't understand. He's getting closer and closer. And here's this great spiritual leader, Antony, cracking jokes. "Why does a chicken coop have 2 doors instead of 4? The hunter can't believe his ears. "What?" And then Antony says, "Because if it had 4 doors, it'd be a chicken sedan." Everybody thinks it's hilarious. The hunter's like still getting closer to this group, can't understand what's going on. Antony starts off again. "There was a grasshopper who hops into a bar in New York. The bartender looks down at this grasshopper and says, 'That's funny, we have a drink named after you.' And the grasshopper responds, 'That is funny. Why do you have a drink named Bob?'" The hunter is in shock. He's come all this way, and Antony is telling jokes? What's going on? Finally, the hunter is recognized. Antony turns around, welcomes him into the circle, and the hunter asks what in the world is going on. Here he came out for some sober spiritual wisdom, and here they're having a great time. What in the world's going on? "I thought you people were miserable," says the hunter. Antony says, "Take out your bow. Stretch it." So the hunter draws his bow. Antony says, "Draw it a little further." And the hunter pulls a little further. The hunter says, "This is about as far as it'll go." And Antony says, "Well, pull it a little further." The hunter says, "If I pull it any further, it's going to snap." And Antony says, "Well, so it is with the brothers and I. We actually do need to let off a little steam and enjoy ourselves. They need to be released from strain or they will snap." Okay. There's a story that comes out of the desert now from a different tradition. It's not the Anchoretic tradition. It's not this ideal of people living on their own, but it's from a Cenobitic tradition. That is from this tradition of monks living together in a communal lifestyle. And there's this story about a brother who had sinned. So the abbot is telling the sinful brother to depart from the community, But as he's leaving the dining hall in shame because of his misdeed, the abbot tells one of the other brothers, stands up and leaves with him because he had realized he was a sinner too. Sort of the, who of you who is without stones, throw the first stone, and they all left. There was an acknowledgement, a sincere acknowledgement of sin in this monastic tradition. After all, they were trying to live lives of holiness. They were trying to live lives of purity and virtue. That was their concern. So there's a tremendous sincerity about dealing with temptation and sin in a way that, again, if I can preach to you, we're pretty careless with. That doesn't really belong in our tradition. The monastic tradition, precisely because it was not a mainstream tradition, could take very rigid stances on sin. Christian traditions that are, quote, mainstream, i.e. that need to accommodate the majority, always tend to be much more lax on sin and spiritual discipline and so on, just because there's the assumption that people aren't really going to be able to handle this. So there's a tolerance for a lot more in these mainstream traditions, whereas in the monastic tradition, there was an urgency. People could actually uphold moral standards that they thought were actually true and right. Some of these stories get embellished over time. Quite certainly is highly embellished, but does show and illustrates the spiritual power of the monk. Hans von Kampenhausen wrote a wonderful piece. I think it was his, no, it wasn't his dissertation, but it was pretty early in his career. Hans von Kampenhausen wrote some pieces about spiritual authority in the early church and traces how in the 4th century spiritual authority, if I can speak loosely, spiritual capital, starts to migrate from the bishop, who had been the center of ecclesiastical decision-making power and the ability to communicate true Christianity. That power had been centered with the bishop. By the end of the 4th century, we have some enormously popular and powerful monks. And the monk is seen to be this new center of spiritual authority, to be able to tell people what real Christianity is. And this will certainly continue through the Middle Ages too. In the Middle Ages, some of the most powerful people in the church are technically abbots of monasteries, not actually bishops or church officials in that regard. Here's a story that illustrates the new spiritual power of the monk. There was a businessman who was going out and to visit a hermit. And the hermit asks, "How are things out in the world? How are things faring? Do people have faith? Do people have enough faith that they can say to this mountain, 'Depart and cast yourself into the sea'?" And just then, as the monk had said that, the businessman feels this terrible rumble on the mountain. The mountain actually starts picking up and starts moving to the ocean with these huge gargantuan waves of activity in motion. And the hermit cries out to the mountain and says, "No, actually, stop. I was just quoting scripture. I wasn't commanding you to cast yourself into the mountain." The mountain settles back down. Well, quite highly embellished. This is the comic book version of the story. As it's come down to us, it's really very much like a superhero, something a superhero would do. Right, it is deeply embellished, but does show the way that these early Christians are imagining the monks have this incredible relationship with God, this extreme spiritual power. Not even Colossus could do that. Come on. Okay. Here's another story illustrating the goodness of the monastic life, the attraction to it. There were 2 old monks sitting in their cave. One monk had come from a long distance. They sit down and they're chatting, catching up on old times. They haven't seen each other in a long time, and they're catching up on all things. And one of the old monks says to a young monk who lives in the neighboring cave, "My son, make us a lentil broth." So the young monk goes out and gathers lentils and starts putting together the soup, and a couple hours later comes back and sets this bowl of soup in front of these 2 old gentlemen. And the next day, the young monk comes to see how these old guys are doing, and one of the old monks says to the young monk, "My son, make us a lentil broth." The young monk looks over, looks at this bowl of soup that he had made for them yesterday, stirs it around. They haven't touched it. Well, the point of the story is that these old monks were so engaged in this delicious spiritual conversation that they frankly just forgot to eat for 24 hours. That's a story that's meant to show you the goodness of the monastic life, that it would be so engaging and riveting, the type of conversation that they're able to hold, and to share these spiritual experiences with one another, that food and the other sacrifices that they had to make really weren't where their concentration and focus was. Okay, let me tell you just a word about the Cenobitic monastic tradition as well, and that will take us to the end of our time. But let me also introduce to you the Cenobitic monastic tradition. If we've been talking about the Anchoritic monastic tradition, that is monks living alone as hermits, there's also something called the Cenobitic monastic tradition. And that is the tradition that from the Middle Ages we'll become much more familiar with, much more familiar with, and that is the tradition of monks living together in groups, in monasteries. Really, the monastery was born out of this Egyptian desert monasticism. Do you remember all these caves? Monks living out all in caves next to one another? Eventually, the monks decide that they want to start building their own caves, and rather than relying on nature to provide them with caves where they could live in community, they just build a monastery with cells in it, small rooms, and that's what a monastery is. By the way, the monastery has had an enormous influence on the university system. It's not so strongly felt anymore, not quite as much as it used to be, but even 100 years ago, you would be able to see clearly, if you visited universities, a strong imprint of monastic culture on the university system. Let me just give you a few clues. For example, at Oxford University, many of those colleges were actually originally set up as monasteries. And so the form of it, and I'm speaking only of the Oxford colleges, but many copy this sort of thing. You'll have a monastery building, and that is your college. You'll have a center courtyard and an open space, and then you'll basically have dormitories on all the sides, windows looking outside on either side of those wings, and those would be your monastic cells. Many of those old colleges at old European universities started as monasteries. Beyond that, too, the life of a student and the life of a monk, there's a relationship there in an odd sort of way. Again, if you're, you may not feel this influence much. Not much of it's preserved necessarily, but there actually is this correlation. Benedict of Nursia, who is the patron saint of Europe, is also the patron saint of students. And that because he was sort of this godfather to the Cenobitic monastic movement, and I'll talk about him probably in a few weeks' time. But Benedict of Nursia is the patron saint of students because that student lifestyle, as it's been developed for hundreds of years, actually has strongly grown out of the monastic tradition. I noticed this for the first time when I went to graduate school. I stepped into my graduate school dorm room at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and I walked in, and there was a bed on this side, like a very small bed here, and then over here there was a desk and a drawer, chest of drawers. This was my room. And the room was very clearly set up, so if I rolled this way, whoosh, I would be in bed, and if I rolled this way, whoosh, I would be at my desk studying. The system was clearly designed that way. It was very effective. I got lots studied. It was awesome. When I went to New York and studied at Fordham University, I walked into my dorm room and discovered, it was in a high-rise, it was on the 12th floor of this apartment building, but discovered amazingly that it was like this flashback to my time at this previous graduate school. The furniture was exactly the same. Here's the bed, here's the desk, and then you have to walk out of the room like this. Truly, the monastic cell and the traditional student dormitory room actually has this sort of genetic connection between it. You live in houses, you live in community, you may not sense that. I'm not sure what your experience is, but there's this deep connection between student culture and between the monastic movement. All right. Saint Pachomius, let me introduce to you, all that we'll have time for is for me to introduce to you this Cenobitic monasticism. Saint Pachomius is, not the first Cenobitic monk, just as Antony of Alexandria is not the first Anchoritic monk, but he becomes the poster child for Cenobitic monasticism. I'm sorry that no matter where I stand, some of you can't see this. Saint Pachomius was born in 292, and while Antony lived to be over 100 years old according to tradition, Saint Pachomius didn't quite make it as long, but he lived into his 50s. He was born to pagan parents in Thebes, Egypt, and as a young man had been taken away as a captive, along with a group of other young men and forced to serve in the Roman army. It's a pretty common occurrence at this time in this place. Pachomius is in a cell waiting for, he's been captured, he's being awaiting training in the Roman army, and he's there all on his own, and Christians from a nearby church community start taking charity to the prisoners there. So they're bringing food and nourishment for him. This is Pachomius' first interaction with Christianity. After getting out of the army, some years later, Pachomius decides that he wants to actually get in touch with this Christian tradition that had shown him this surprising act of charity so many years ago in his youth. And he sets out to find Antony, who's the most popular Christian, the most famous Christian that he had ever heard of. So without any further church connections, he wants to go meet Antony. Sort of like, Antony, again, was during his day as popular as Billy Graham. It's like the first Christian that you might think of, Saint Antony. I'll go see if I can find him. He does manage to go to the Egyptian desert and actually is able to gather around with those who were celebrating this monastic life with Antony. Pachomius comes up with an idea that changes history. The idea is the monastery. Why, instead of relying on natural caves to provide us our shelter, why don't we band together as a community? And the really brilliant thing about the monastery is that not only would it provide for our physical needs and so on, but there are spiritual needs that actually need to be met in community too. That's Pachomius' big idea. A number of these monks, you remember when Antony is passing out from spiritual warfare and from probably lack of nourishment and water in his cell and so on. People are taking risks with themselves. And Pachomius wants to sort of mitigate that. He thinks that if people are living this ascetic lifestyle in community, they'll do it much more responsibly and in a much more healthy fashion. So that's part of the motivation for the monastery as well. The way Pachomius would describe it is not everybody's cut out to be a superstar. Not everyone can go fasting for weeks on end and so on. So in order to make this life make sense for all types of people, let's band together and have this moderated by a community. Let's have a monastery. And so he founds a monastery. The monastery catches on in a crazy popular way. It just, in a few generations, just grows to be an enormous network. And it starts with Pachomius. I think the numbers are, in Pachomius' lifetime, he helps found 9 monasteries, and he does this with a brother of his, and they found monasteries. Of course, once you can get a monastery going, then you can transplant monasteries pretty quickly, because they hive off like bees, right? You get a community going, and they're in it for God. They're not there because of any geographical or other worldly concern. So they're quite mobile, and you can just keep setting up monasteries. You can take 10 brothers, hive them off, and go start a new monastery, and they start a lifestyle, and eventually you get other monks attracted to this lifestyle. So it spreads very quickly. Within a couple generations, you have thousands, literally thousands of monasteries, 5,000 to 7,000 monasteries dotting all across the Levant. You have all the way in modern-day Israel, in Jordan, in Egypt, in North Africa, in Syria, in eastern parts of the outside of the bounds of the Roman Empire as well. The monastic movement just explodes. In the history of Christianity, this is one of the larger success stories. It's rather instantaneous. It penetrates Christian culture deeply and permanently and spreads around the world in a few generations. It's a remarkable phenomenon. Okay, time does not permit me to tell other stories of great heroes of the faith like Macarius the Great, who ran away from his fiancée and became a monk and inspired many, many others. Or St. Martin of Tours. Maybe I'll tell you the story of St. Martin of Tours, just because he gives us our first look at Western monasticism as it comes into the continent of Europe, and also because I probably have not convinced you at this point that monasticism was a good evangelistic tool. Martin of Tours begins to show us how that monasticism actually can be an effective means of spreading the gospel, where the institutions of civilization are weak or insufficient. Monasticism actually becomes a marvelous infrastructure from which to spread Christian influence. But for time's sake, I'll quit there. Do you have any comments or questions? I'll take a few, and then we'll have one more quiz before we close the hour. Patrick, please go ahead. Where do they get their food? That's a great question. And honestly, it's been a few years since I've read Antony's Life by Athanasius, but I don't think he touches any of those details. So that's a very good question. The model of a self-sustaining monastery, like the farm monastery, that's really a Northern European thing. And so that, well, European generally. That's a Western European thing. They're not going to be running farms or running businesses or that sort of thing as they will in later periods. I think it's a pretty scarce life. I think they're gathering what they can. Apparently they can get lentils. And I think there is some gift giving, so they're receiving gifts from the outside too. And I think they don't eat much. I don't know, Patrick. Good. Go ahead, please. As individuals, they'd have a craft. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Other questions or thoughts, comments? Thank you for that. Go ahead. Sure. Some of these guys, Antony is going to be born in the middle of the 3rd century. Pachomius is born in the late 3rd century. But it's really after the Council of Nicaea that this starts to become popular. It's in the middle 4th century, late 4th century that this really explodes. Good. Other questions? Dee Dee, please. Good. I'll touch on it a little bit. We'll talk about that next week with Martin of Tours. But the question will not go away. That probably is the real difference between the evangelical spirituality and a monastic spirituality. And I can't begin to tell you what's authentic about it and what's not authentic, how much of it is an excuse and how much of it's genuine. But the evangelical position tends persistently to be, if you remove yourself from society, you're avoiding what Christ gave you to do, which is the Great Commission. So you're actually abandoning your Christian faith or life. You're abandoning your Christian task, let's say that, by living in a solitary way. The monks will see it very differently, but that won't be resolved. We'll talk past each other on that point. Good. Really great point, Dee Dee. Any other questions? Okay. How about Palmer? Can you lead us in our last quiz? Thank you.
Okay, does everybody want to get on Blackboard? Can you raise your hand if you're not on Blackboard? Okay, so most of you are. Cool. Question 1. This is from the first half, just so you guys know. According to the lecture, what was Arius' philosophical presupposition that led him to say that Jesus is not God? A. Jesus is a son. Sons are created, therefore Jesus is not God. B. God is essentially unbegotten. Jesus is begotten, therefore Jesus is not God. C. God is invisible. Jesus was visible, therefore Jesus is not God. D. God is one, therefore Jesus is not God, or E, Jesus loves me?
Is E extra credit?
Nope. E is not extra credit.
Okay,
E would
sorry.
be wrong because that was not Arius' philosophical
Sure.
presupposition. So while it's true in and of itself, it would be wrong as an answer to the actual question. Question 2. According to the traditional view, which of the following choices represents the three views held at the Council of Nicaea? A. Arianism, Semi-Arianism, and Orthodoxy. B. Arianism, Sabellianism, and Orthodoxy. C. Semi-Arianism, Sabellianism, and Orthodoxy. D. Homoousianism, Origenism, and Orthodoxianism. Or E. Arianism, Oppositism, and Heterousianism. Is that confusing enough for you guys? Question 3. According to the lecture, who was Constantine's theological advisor? A. Hosius. B. Eusebius of Nicomedia. C. Alexander of Alexandria. D. Eusebius of Caesarea. Or E. Athanasius of Alexandria. Question 4. According to Dr. Armstrong, which doctrine is the very heartbeat of theology? A. Baptismal regeneration. B. Ecumenism. C. Transubstantiation. D. Brotherly love. Or E. The eternal generation of the Son. And question 5. According to the lecture, what Greek word distinguishes the Orthodox view at the Council of Nicaea? Is it A. Substantia, B. Heterousia, C. Homoousia, D. Hypostasis, or E. Homoousia?
Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you next week. If you have questions and you'd like to chat, I'll be here again, as always, early before the class. You're always free to chat with me then if office hours don't work out for you. Thank you.